the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, Episode 22.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R² Global.
Welcome to another edition of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray. It is so good to have you today. On today's episode, we get into LNG with Alan Herbst. Hope you enjoy. Well, Alan, a few episodes back, we brought on a guest and we talked about LNG and we talked about all the changes that's coming up in the industry. And, we reached out to you to kind of come in and clarify what's happening with some of this legislation that we're seeing coming down the pike. It's good to have you on the show today. How are you doing?
Thank you very much, Ryan, for inviting me. And it's good to be here. And sure, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the new legislation and also what's going on in the industry with various energy-related topics such as bunker fuels and LNG. So it's good to be here.
Absolutely. So I want to get to the tankers and what's going on there with the sulfur and the emissions and stuff like that. But let's first kind of start here stateside. And, we're recording this late March, and President Trump's kind of halfway through his first 100 days, and he's really tried to focus so far, it seems, on deregulation in the energy business here stateside. What kind of impact are you seeing just generally with the oil and gas or energy in general in the U.S. economy?
Sure. Yeah, it definitely looks like he is a pro-energy president, pro-oil and gas president, and wants to streamline a lot of the regulatory hurdles that were perhaps out there before. When you look at, the U.S. needs a lot of infrastructure development to bring oil and gas to markets. Especially look at pipeline development, such as for natural gas. There is a huge build-out required just because there's been a geographic shift of where this oil and gas is coming from. Over the past 8 or 10 years, you've seen a huge increase in production for natural gas in the northeast part of the U.S., in the Marcellus shale, which is primarily in Pennsylvania, and in the past few years also in the Utica shale, which is neighboring that over in Ohio. Because of that, you've got that production is probably 24 BCF a day of natural gas production. And it's a huge chunk of the production in the U.S. But the problem is that there's a sort of glut of natural gas in the region, and you need pipelines to be built out to bring that gas to market. Again, this glut in the region is clearly shown in pricing. Most people are familiar with the Henry Hub benchmark price, which is in Louisiana. That's around $3 today, MMBTU. But when you look in the Northeast, again, in the Marcellus in New York State and Pennsylvania, Ohio, you can see gas prices under $2 in MMBTU just because there's so much supply and you can't get the gas out of the market, so it is depressing prices. So in order to, there's a need for pipeline development. For natural gas pipelines, especially interstate pipelines, the FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, they're responsible for certifying and regulating all the construction of and build out of this infrastructure. And again, it's a government agency. They have done a pretty good job. In fact, in 2016, they certified 17.6 BCF a day of new pipeline capacity. And in 2017, actually, in the first couple of months, they've approved 7 BCF a day of new natural gas pipeline capacity. So they have been making progress. Actually, one of the things that's sort of maybe temporarily hindering progress is that there are 5 commissioners on the FERC, and you need 3 to have a quorum. And recently, one of the 5 or the 3 that were currently on place resigned. So right now, you only have 2 acting commissioners on the FERC, and you need to get at least another commissioner there before more certifications of pipelines can be done. But again, the administration has, is probably going to, bring on pro-development commissioners. So I would expect the pipeline build-out to continue, especially in the Northeast and the Southeast, which is sort of the epicenter of pipeline construction in the U.S.
Okay, for the audience members who don't know, walk us through just real quick. You touched on the FERC commissioners. How will that process go, and what kind of timetable are we looking at before we get that position filled?
Well, again, I would expect something to be done in the next few months to have new appointments and to get those open positions staffed. Generally, the FERC has been doing a better job time-wise, sort of approving projects. They have added attorneys to the staff because, again, they had such a sort of an influx of projects. They just maybe didn't have the bodies a few years ago to handle it. So right now, you can see a lot of new pipeline capacity coming on in this year, 2017, 2018. So I expect definitely the build out to continue for the next 2 or 3 years for pipelines, especially natural gas pipelines, and in the northeast part of the U.S. There's also a role that they play when you're reversing pipelines. So again, a lot of these existing pipelines were built during a time where a lot of the natural gas went from the west to east, or from the Gulf Coast to the northeast. And now it's sort of taking hold in Newcastle. So we have all this gas in the northeast. Some of the pipelines are reversing their flows and actually sending their natural gas the other way. And so the FERC is involved with that. And an example of those pipelines that's sort of reversing its flow is the Rockies Express pipeline. I kind of refer to that as the sort of transcontinental railroad of natural gas pipelines. It's a huge pipeline, about 1.7, 1.8 BCF a day, that goes from Colorado, Wyoming area all the way to the eastern part of Ohio. And over the years, the amount of gas transport in that pipeline has been declining, again, due to production coming from Pennsylvania and Ohio. So a few years ago, the operators of and owners of that pipeline, one of the operators and the owners is Tallgrass, let's say, that they actually applied to reverse the flow for part of that pipeline, the most eastern part of that pipeline, to bring natural gas westward to sort of cities such as Chicago or St. Louis, or even into Canada. So you see that, so again, there are changes going on in how gas is supplied, the flow, which way the pipelines flow, how they're utilized, and new ones being constructed. And the FERC plays a role in all of that.
You actually kind of went to my next question. I was going to ask, I remember I was at an event 2-3 years ago, I remember, and they were talking about, I believe, reversing some pipelines from the Northeast going down to Florida. And so I don't know if you're familiar with what's going on there, but what kind of role can we expect long-term on these reversing pipelines? Because that's kind of where I wanted to go, is I know that this has been going on. Have we kind of peaked there, or can we see a lot more of this in the next 5 to 10 years?
Sure. Well, there's new pipelines being built that will take gas, again, from Marcellus and Utica to the southeast. The southeast is going to be a region with quite a bit of demand, a new demand. So the northeast is sort of trying to catch up with demand, or capacity to meet that demand, while the southeast has a lot of new demand. So sort of new industry, new plants, growth of population. So they're taking more gas just because it's organic growth in that area. So you do have, like Transco is a large pipeline that's reversed at some point, or has the capability to bring gas from the northeast down to the southeast. Again, there are several other pipelines being built. So again, this is an area where you see a lot of interest. You see existing assets, pipelines that have been, taking gas from point A to point B, and all of a sudden point B doesn't need the gas, and these are fixed assets. So instead of abandoning these pipelines, it's relatively easy to reverse the flow on them. You need to get some permits, you need to, put in some compressors going the other way, and you can, change the direction on these pipelines relatively easily. And you don't really have to go through a lot of the regulatory hurdles or right-of-ways that you'd have with sort of building a new pipeline. So again, pipeline reversal has become a sort of a big issue and a topic that a lot of people are interested in right now.
Okay, so I want to get to the tankers in just a second and how that's going to tie into this natural gas issue. But let's kind of walk the audience through this process. As you've kind of touched on it a little bit, we're trying to get it from point A to point B. And then at some point we hear the magical LNG, which is the talk really of the oil and gas side of the industry right now. LNG. Kind of give us just a 30,000-foot view of what's going on. So we're drilling the gas, we're sending it in a pipeline, we're putting it into a plant, and then we get LNG. And then why is that such a critical phase of this of natural gas processes?
Sure. LNG, liquefied natural gas, is critical right now because it really represents a new demand center. Again, I mentioned earlier that we've had such a build out of natural gas production. So, production's probably increased, 4 40% over the past, less than a decade. So there is a glut of natural gas in the U.S., and so it has affected prices. Back in, let's say, 2008, natural gas was, it could be $13 an MMBTU, and maybe it was $8 or $6. But since then, it really has declined, and you've seen now that we've, $2 natural gas is not uncommon. Right now, I guess we're at $3. We've had some sort of late winter demand. It's pushed prices up. But again, there's been a huge increase in production. A lot of the seasonality of price has gone out of the commodity. So even in the winter, the price doesn't have the commodity of natural gas doesn't have the same price volatility that it had in prior years, let's say a decade ago. And that's due to just because there's an abundant supply of it. So in the wake of that, you start looking for new markets for the natural gas. So, thoughts were potentially, we've had a lot of fuel switching on the utility side. So a lot of the utilities that were burning coal switched to natural gas if they could. And you've seen now that more natural gas is burned by utilities than coal. So they've picked up a lot of market share there. Also, they've thought about, the petrochemical industry is also a huge user of natural gas. Both natural gas or NGLs, natural gas liquids found in natural gas. And because of that, you've seen a huge number of petrochemical projects being built on the Gulf Coast, in the Southeast, and elsewhere. And for the past decade or so, there haven't been any because it was cheaper to build those petrochemical plants in the Middle East or Far East where they thought had cheaper feedstocks. But now with all the natural gas in the U.S., you can get the feedstocks for those petrochemical plants, and it's become an attractive investment. So petrochemical supply is another market for the natural gas. The thought was you might also have a lot of vehicles using it, such as trucks, cars, and that's been a little slow to take off for various infrastructure reasons. So again, with all those even those three sources of new demand, there's still a glut of natural gas out there, let's say. And the new market potentially is to export the natural gas. So you could, liquefy it and ship it overseas. And there's a growing market for LNG overseas as sort of a fuel replacement for oil. And so we see that happening right now in the Gulf Coast primarily. We're building a lot of liquefaction facilities to export this natural gas. If you went back 10 years ago, the thought was the U.S. would be short on natural gas. We were actually building LNG import terminals, and we built a number of those. We have about 11 now in the U.S., and the thought is either to convert some of them to export terminals or build, sort of greenfield LNG projects where you could export the natural gas. So that's the plan right now. The thought is in a few years, again, the Cheniere at the Sabine Pass plant in Louisiana is already exporting LNG. But you might have 4 other plants join them shortly. So in a couple of years, you could have almost 10 BCF a day of natural gas being exported from the U.S. in the form of LNG. And that's about 12% of the current market. So the thought is that might help support prices to some degree.
You mentioned Cheniere there. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems kind of like I don't want to say got lucky, but they were trying to meet the demand that you talked about where, hey, we're going to be short natural gas. And then all of a sudden, while they're going through that process, it's like, oh, no, we've got too much natural gas. And they kind of kudos to them for shifting their strategy. But they kind of, went into it with one goal in mind and then shifted mid I don't know if mid play is the right way to describe it, but they shifted. And now they've kind of almost emerged as a leader in the U.S. because of how it kind of worked out. Would you kind of agree with that synopsis, or what's your take on what happened there with Cheniere?
100%. Cheniere has first mover advantage. Classic example of that. They basically went ahead and built an LNG import terminal at a time where LNG import terminals weren't really being built. And they took on a lot of debt to do it. They were a small company. And after they got the thing built, basically the market changed on them, and there was no need to import LNG into the U.S. Back in 2007, there were 777 BCF of LNG imported to the U.S., and probably a year or two ago, it was down to 50 BCF. So the market really crashed for LNG imports. Didn't make sense economically to import LNG. But Cheniere, again, spent billions of dollars or borrowed billions of dollars to build an LNG import terminal. So at that point, they decided, well, let's convert it to an export terminal. So they went out and got more money, and basically, first mover also built the liquefaction facilities on site, and now they started exporting LNG last year. They have now 2 trains running out of a potential 5, I believe, and they're also working on another LNG export terminal in Corpus Christi, and there are about 2 or 3 other terminals also being built by other owner-operators. Again, they were sort of first to market, and it really has changed the global industry of LNG because, again, it has to do with pricing. Traditionally, especially in the Far East, all LNG was priced off of oil. It was oil indexed. And so the price of oil was high. The importers of LNG paid a lot for the LNG, such as the Japanese were paying a lot for LNG when crude oil was over $100 a barrel. The thing about U.S. LNG exports, they appear to be or are being indexed off of natural gas, off of Henry Hub natural gas, which is relatively inexpensive now due to the glut of natural gas in the U.S. So the U.S. LNG represents a huge cost savings for a lot of international buyers, and there's a lot of interest in purchasing it because it's a lot cheaper than buying LNG from other producers such as Qatar or Malaysia or even Australia or elsewhere. So it's really has changed the market, the U.S. production, and its pricing is shifting in that commodity.
Okay, so one final question is about natural gas in general, and we'll get on to the regulations. And this is just, help me walk through this. We've talked about this. You mentioned a couple times now the glut of natural gas in the U.S., but you've also said, hey, there's a need internationally. Is it that if we could export enough natural gas, the glut would go down, you think? Or are we kind of meeting the demand internationally and we're just being able to keep up with the supply here stateside?
That's a good question. There's growing international demand. There's excess surplus production, surplus import capacity, more regas facilities are being built. But also, U.S. natural gas production continues to increase. There are thoughts, even with prices relatively low, there are thoughts that you'll still see more production coming out of Marcellus and Utica. And so that's really sort of driving the market at this point. There are a lot of other basins that are also producing sizable quantities of natural gas. You've got a lot coming out of the Permian and Niobrara and Haynesville, but there's just Marcellus and Utica are really sort of world-class producers of natural gas. They have some benefits that they're located near population centers, so it is a good supply. Again, if you can get it to market with infrastructure build out. So there's a lot of interest in the continuing growth in those areas. So there are a lot of forces at play here. How does the global market look for LNG? How are other producers going to price their commodity? How much can the U.S. export without having it really adversely affect pricing domestically? Those are all issues that the FERC and others look at, where they figure, how much natural gas can be exported without adversely affecting prices domestically.
Okay, so let's get into the marine fuel sulfur regulations. Kind of what are they, and why should we be concerned about them as energy professionals?
Right. Yeah. These are the new IMO regulations that are going to go into effect on January 1st, 2020. Again, the IMO is the International Maritime Organization. It's a part of the UN. And they're basically responsible to ensure safety at sea for both human life and the environment. And what's happened over the years is that no one really thinks too much about the shipping industry, but over the years, they've really been. If you went back a couple of decades ago, it was pretty lax about the fuel that they burn. So they would burn sort of the cheapest available, which would be sort of high sulfur residual fuel oil, or also known as bunker fuel. And so this could have, if you went back 10 years ago, some of this fuel was, 4.5% sulfur fuel, relatively, dirty fuel, and create a lot of emissions. And again, when these vessels were on the high seas, no one looked that closely. There wasn't a lot of enforcement for sulfur. Sometimes when they got into port, they would switch to cleaner burning fuels. But generally, the shipping industry was known for burning higher sulfur fuels. And by shipping, it's both commercial shipping or even like cruise lines and things like that. So what's happened over the years is that the IMO has been sort of putting stricter sulfur limitations on the fuels that can be burned. Right now, the maximum sulfur content for bunker fuels is 3.5%, unless you're in an emission control area. And those are a couple areas around the U.S. and the Caribbean and in Northwest Europe, sort of Baltic Sea, and where within 200 miles of the coast, you have to burn 0.1% sulfur. So that's currently with the guidelines, 3.5% sulfur, unless you're in an emission control area, it's 0.1% sulfur. A couple of months ago, the IMO announced new emissions guidelines, again, taking effect on January 1st, 2020. That will lower the maximum sulfur to 0.5% in non-ECA areas. So the maximum you can burn on the high seas is 0.5% sulfur. And again, emission control areas will stay at 0.1% sulfur. So that is a huge change in the shipping industry. And it gives about 3 years for the ship owners and operators to think about what they're going to do. Basically, there are three strategies. You can install scrubbers, which basically control sulfur emissions, and those will cost anywhere from, like, say, $1 million per vessel to maybe $3 million a vessel. You can shift to burn lower sulfur fuels, such as MDO or MGO, which are more diesel-based and with a higher cost. Or you can think about installing, either retrofitting your existing ships or with new build vessels, having them powered by LNG, liquefied natural gas. Again, we have this glut of LNG in the U.S. or in the world. And again, LNG, if you just look at the sort of emissions, like parts per million, for residual fuel oil or bunker fuels, it's 35,000 to 45,000 parts per million sulfur. If you look at LNG, it's 1 part per million sulfur. So it's dramatically, there's basically no emissions of sulfur emissions coming out of LNG. So it's a very clean fuel. And so there is a sort of an effort by some to increase the market penetration of LNG globally in the shipping fleet. So that's where we are right now. It's an interesting market because there are relatively few vessels that are actually powered by LNG at this point. The LNG carriers, the tankers that transport LNG, will use the boil-off gas as fuel. But if you're a non-LNG tanker, let's say, if you're a cargo ship or a passenger ferry or other type of commercial ship, the vast majority are not using, almost all of them are not using LNG. Globally right now, there are about 120 vessels that are powered by LNG. Most of them are passenger ferries or oil service type vessels. There are a few container ships, maybe about 15 or so. Most of these vessels are operating in sort of the Northwest Europe. There are a few operate in the U.S., sort of going on runs from Florida down to the Caribbean. So there's a limited amount of vessels in the U.S. currently using LNG, but more are being built, and a lot of cruise lines are sort of going green, and some of the new build ships are LNG fueled vessels too. So it is a market that's changing, and it'd be interesting to see how it develops. There are also different expectations about how many vessels we converted and what the impact of those are on the LNG markets and also on the residual fuel oil or bunker fuel markets.
Okay, so I've got to ask this because when the government's involved, you always are curious of how practical is this? Is 2020 a reasonable deadline to get, no matter what solution you go with, implemented for these tankers?
Right. That's a good point. When the IMO has their meetings, there was a lot of debate about the potential date for these new regulations. Again, they settled on January 1st, 2020. There was another proposal to have it start in 2025. And some of the ship owners or operators prefer the 2025 date. Just gives them more time. Again, it's a challenging industry and they're not making a lot of money, a lot of them don't want to go through the cost of either retrofitting or buying new vessels or installing scrubbers or using lower sulfur, higher cost fuels. So there was some debate about that, but the IMO went with the January 1st, 2020 guideline. Right now, that's the timetable. There are some thoughts that maybe they might make an extension. We're less than 3 years away from that. So maybe as you get closer to 2020, some of the ship owners and operators might ask for an extension. So Not exactly 100% sure what's going to happen, but right now, January 1st, 2020 is the date for the new, sulfur regulations.
Okay, so from a business standpoint, I'm sure that these companies are looking at it short-term impact, long-term impact, and because we don't really know what the long-term price of LNG will be. There's always predictions, but we don't really know. In the short term, is it cheaper to kind of transition the ship to the LNG, or is it cheaper to go with the scrubber, or what is the cheapest solution there?
Right. There are a lot of variables. It has to do a lot with the vessel, size of vessel, fuel consumption, where it operates, the age of the vessel, and then the cost of fuel. Right now, the price of crude oil has come down quite a bit, so the price of residual fuel oil or bunker fuel is also relatively low. So you can say it has a price advantage. Fuel oil will have a price advantage right now over LNG. The thoughts are that if crude oil makes a little bit of a rebound in price, that LNG, especially when LNG gets built out more, distribution network, LNG would be cheaper. So right now, LNG may not be cheaper, but the thoughts are going forward due to the abundant supply of natural gas in the U.S. So if you're sort of pricing it off of the Gulf Coast or Henry Hub, that LNG would be a cheaper fuel to use going forward. If you go out, is it 5 or 10 years forward?
Right. It's always curious when you look at some of these numbers and how they try to make these, predictions, and I feel bad for it because it's really, it's really just kind of a guessing game on some level to try to figure out what the future is going to look like to make the best decision for your business. When you got to change your whole fleet of ships on what's going on there. So
some operators are like, yes, we want to be seen as very green, and they're interested, and they're actively looking at the fuel and making plans to convert vessels. Other operators are saying, well, we don't really know if these new regulations are going to go through. We could always install scrubbers, or we could, use lower sulfur fuels. Another issue is sort of the supply security issue. So if if you have a vessel that's operating globally, and if you can get bunkers in let's say 170 ports around the world, how many of those ports will have LNG available? Right. So, if only 50 ports have LNG available, 3 or 4 years from now, are those ports sufficient for you to operate your vessels? Right. So that's a supply security issue. Sort of, same thing with, let's say, a CNG vehicle in the U.S. If you're driving that around, is there a service station that has CNG fuel that you'll have access to?
Right.
So that's the same thing if you're a ship owner and that's an issue. If you have a vessel that's going on a route back and forth, let's say like a cruise line, they leave, from Florida, they go to the Caribbean, they come back. That's a regular route, and you kind of think, okay, that's a good, and also might operate in an emission control area, which is a lower sulfur. So there you have a good candidate for LNG. Again, a lot of the vessels, but a lot of the container ships, cargo ships are also looking at it. And again, a few of these vessels are being built right now. I guess the owners of those operators have to look at, do I sort of convert them with scrubbers? And again, very few, about 1% of the market has been converted to scrubbers. The thoughts are you might have 15 or 20% converted in a few years. So some vessels will go that route. They'll continue to burn high sulfur bunker fuels. They'll just install scrubbers in their stacks and reduce emissions that way.
Okay, so I'll kind of let you go with this question here. Right now, we have an abundance of natural gas, and it seems it's going to be that way for a while. But I have seen some predictions that show that 10, 15, 20 years from now, natural gas prices could get relatively high. Probably not to 2008 levels, but get back up maybe $6, $7. And oil potentially could level out and be a little bit more stable in the next 10 to 15 years. A, do you agree with those predictions? And B, what kind of impact would these tankers have on the price? Is it enough to really, assuming that, the perfect world scenario you kind of laid out, there's enough spots and all this, I know there's a lot of talk of a lot of different industries getting into being powered by natural gas. Is this a big enough industry to really affect the price, or would it be an insignificant bump there?
Again, forecasting prices is difficult.
We're gonna hold you to it. So,
I could see, oil right now we're kind of in this kind of $45 to $60 range, let's say, and I would see that as sort of holding for a few years to come. It's hard, the further you go out, it's difficult to say, but there is, we talk about natural gas production in the U.S. There's also a lot of, shale oil or tight oil production, which is, now about 55% of the amount of oil produced in the U.S. So again, if you went back, 10 years ago, the U.S. was producing 5 million barrels a day or just under 5 million barrels a day. Now we hit over 9 million, last year. We kind of came off, under 9. We're back up to 9 million barrels a day now. And there are thoughts that the Permian could kick out another 1 million barrels a day easily over the next 2 years. It's almost that there's a fair amount of oil in the world, and I guess there's some move to use other fuels. So I'm not a huge oil price bull. I kind of think we're unless there's some unexpected growth or unexpected geopolitical event, you might be in an environment with $50, $60 oil for some time to come. Price of natural gas is, again, there's still more natural gas to be drilled in the U.S., and I think it's going to keep prices relatively low domestically for natural gas. So I think that helps the LNG market. It helps the vessels to use LNG. It would be easier for LNG or natural gas if the price of crude did go up. If you had that big spread if crude went back to $100 a barrel, then it's sort of a no-brainer to use natural gas or use LNG. But again, LNG is cleaner. There's a move to utilize the fuel. There are stricter international regulations. So, it's I'm not saying that every vessel is going to become an LNG fueled vessel. They're different. By 2040, you might only have about 10% of the global fleet of vessels using LNG as a fuel. So their thoughts are that this sort of conversion is not going to happen overnight. It's going to take decades, and at some point you'll get a decent amount of market share. So if it's 10% of the global fleet, and the global fleet of commercial vessels around 50,000 vessels, then by 2040 you could have 5,000 LNG-fueled vessels running around out there. Again, a lot of those vessels also are operating in coastal regions. They are passenger ferries, car ferries, oil and gas support vessels. But there is, growing interest to use them as in cargo ships and in tankers. So you will see some movement there. And also, again, LNG used for cruise ships. Because even if there's a higher expense, a lot of the cruise lines can sort of show themselves as being green, and that means a lot, I guess, to the passengers and to the cruise line. So I think that the cruise ship industry is an industry that will embrace LNG.
Well, Alan, this was just a really informative discussion for me, and I know the audience. Where can people find you and connect with you if they want to reach out and have other questions?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Alan Herbst. My firm is Utilis Advisory Group, and you can find us online, utilisadvisory.com. You can give me a phone call if you want. I'm at 917-371-8161, or send me an email, Herbst, AHERBST, at Utilis, UTILIS advisory.com.
Okay, great. And we will link to all that in the show notes, guys, so you can go there and find Alan and all of his contact information. Alan, you've been gracious with your time, and we look forward to having you on again in the future. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate the time today. Glad to speak with you and your guests.
Thanks again for Alan for coming on the show. Really enjoyed the discussion, and our book giveaway winner will be announced via email. So, like I said, not going to mention the full name, but Jason, and I believe he's in Ohio. So, be looking for an email for that, and we will be doing one more giveaway for May. So, stay tuned for that. If you go to the website, globalenergymedia.com, you can opt in for a chance to win the May giveaway and find out exactly what it is. Thank you so much for tuning in. We really appreciate it. And until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.